Before I introduce Mallory, who's going to come in and be the star, like I said, this is a project that started internally a few years ago to educate our own team on what the consumer mindsets were going to be for the year ahead. And then we decided to go ahead and start projecting that out to the group here because we know that it influences everything that we do from marketing. So Mallory Collins, who's coming in, she is our Director of Brand Strategy and Creative here. Really can't have great creative and great brand strategy without insights. So I'm very excited to introduce Mallory to share these insights that we have for you, along with some predictions and including how we did last year as well on the predictions that we had. So without further ado, we've got Mallory Collins.
Got this mic. Thanks so much, Reed, for the nice intro and for getting us started this morning. I really am happy to be back with all of you, a lot of familiar faces, all of you online. Thanks so much for joining. And at Red Door, we like to time this annual conversation about consumer insights around Valentine's Day. And I was thinking about that. I actually don't know the exact reason why we chose to do that, Tyler. So I had a little fun with it. So one theory I had was, well, everybody likes theme, but that's a little bit of superficial for Red Door. We usually have a little more depth than that. And then I thought, well, all of my coworkers see how much I really enjoy and play with and have fun with consumer research and consumer insights. So maybe it's a play on my love for insights, my love for research, how I like to get in there and dig in. But then I thought, ooh, that's giving a little lame. So I'm going to save my reputation and come up with something a little bit different here. I have lots of hobbies, lots of friends, I swear. I like research, but I like other things too. So I'm going to go with the fact that Valentine's Day, like consumer insights, is an utter contradiction. Do any of you know any of the dark history of Valentine's Day? I went down a little black hole. So actually, in the history of it, if you look it up, it's this Roman festival, and it was called Lupercalia. And what would happen there is these priests, they were called Luperci, they would actually sacrifice goats and dogs. They would smear the blood on their foreheads, and then they would walk around and meander around town, whipping the women. And this was supposed to really create fertility. It was a sign to the god of agriculture. I'm sure the jury's still out on if that really worked, but here we are. So there's other dark past theories like the martyr of Saint Valentine or this deemed love lottery. But no matter what you believe, I want you to think today a little bit about that idea, about consumer insights being an utter contradiction. I think sometimes we think it has to be rational, it has to make sense, but Reed always tells me two things can be true at the same time. So make that space in your brains and in your minds for there's a rational side, but there's always also that side of what might not make sense. So we're going to play around with that a lot today. So as we get in, I want to just introduce you to what it is that we're going to cover today. So if we take a look at that agenda, what we're going to go through is, if you haven't been here before, welcome. Welcome if it's your first time. If you're back in the room or online, it's really great to have you again. Our speaker series is our really twice a year celebration and interaction where we really take one of our core values, and that core value is share. It really exemplifies our love for passion, for spreading knowledge outside the walls of Red Door. And this is a space where we like to share that knowledge, share those insights, and give you some practical tools as marketers. So first, we're going to pause. So we're going to talk about the consumer mindset and marketing. So how does the consumer mindset tie directly into marketing? Why are you here today? Then we're going to go into what I call a 2024 report card. So I was sitting here with a lot of you almost to the day last year. We did a similar talk about consumer mindsets. How did we net out? How did we do? And let's use that to inform this year's mindsets. Then we're going to pursue, so we're going to chase some of these key influences. So what's swirling in the minds of Americans and consumers today that ultimately shapes what that consumer mindset in 2025 is. And then we're going to play around. This is my favorite part. The idea here is information for me can go in and out one ear, but if I have that chance to actually apply it and learn it, that's where it really sticks. So we have a couple of interesting predictions. So given these consumer mindsets, what's going to happen this year in marketing? And then we're going to kind of look around at what are some practical ways to apply that. So there are some handouts. If you're in the room with me, you have a physical copy. Sriya has some more if you want to grab them. Take notes, jot those down, and I'll prompt you to ask for your great ideas and great thinking. If you're online, that handout has been posted to the chat. So feel free to use that as your scratch pad to play around. All right. So wanted to open up with this quote. It's ultimately a brand resides in the mind of the consumers. So I lead up our brand strategy and creative team at Red Door. And this is, if you will, a focus that we have every day, day in and day out. And I think it's pretty striking. This was a quote by Achenbaum. He's one of the most beloved execs and planners of the 20th century. And what it really means is that we don't actually own brand, consumers own it. So being empathetic and being understanding that we have to understand the mind of the consumer and what's swirling around up here. Again, there can be contradictions, it can be confusing sometimes, in order to figure out what our brand means and how to effectively reach consumers. And then I might dig a little bit into the value of brand. So if you're like, okay, I understand that brand is going to live in the mind of the consumers, but what's the actual value to me? Why do I need to think about brand? Why do I need to think about the consumer? Appealing to the human instinct is the blueprint for a successful business. We have so many even metaphors, analogies in our daily life that we use and that we use in business that directly tie back to this human instinct. If you think about something going viral, the supply chain, change agents, that all has that biological foundation. And what's important to remember about that is that humans, companies, all of us are acting with our natural instinct. We're really acting and feeling with things that feel natural to us. So therefore, in order to have a successful business, in order to drive successful results, we have to appeal to human instinct. And if you're still like a little on the fence about this and not sure, I'm going to take it a step further and bring in my friend Scott Galloway. Galloway, if you don't know him, is a professor of marketing at NYU, and he's a podcaster, entrepreneur, author, and this is from a course that a couple of us at Red Door, myself included, got to participate in. It's called Section 4. And the premise of it is that there are some really key and overarching factors if you look at the most successful businesses out there, the ones that achieve over $1 trillion in value at some point. There's a formula for those. And the first and foremost component and most important part of that formula is that a company or a product must appeal to daily human needs. It must appeal to human instinct. So to give you a couple of quick examples, Amazon. Think of Amazon as physically the gut. It represents consumption, more for less. We're always wanting to chug along and have this temple of fulfilling our endless needs, or fulfilling our hunger. Or Alphabet, Google, that's really the brain. So even with AI, they're still really the ones that are dominating and have dominated. People spend so much time there getting answers to their questions, feeling more questions, and therefore that really appeals to the brain, that thought process, and all of those unanswered questions that we have. So as marketers, as the landscape gets even more complex, quicker, consumer preferences change, we have technology, the ball keeps getting moved down the line and things get harder and harder. So how do we win in that landscape? We have to go back to those basics and appeal to those daily human needs. So what does this mean to you as a marketer? Many of you who are sitting in this room today or are online are marketers. So if you think about it, and this is a little play, John and I co-authored a brand building playbook. Check it out. This stat is from that, but only 5% of your target audience is ready to buy in your category right now. 5%. That's it. Whether it's B2B, B2C, think about what that means. What do we do about the rest of that 95%? Well, we have to build brand awareness, brand preference, brand affinity so that when that time comes, we're the natural choice. And the way that we do that, again, is putting on that cap of what the consumer mindset is, sitting in their shoes and saying, what would be resonant to me? What would appeal to my instinct? What problems would I need to solve? What are those category entry points that would prompt that consumer to start thinking about my brand and my product? So before we go forward, we're going to have some fun looking back. And I just want to preface and give a disclaimer that predictions are a dangerous business. So a good batting average is 50%. Okay, I think we did pretty well. So we're going to take a look at how did we do last year. So this is our handy dandy report card. So a star means we nailed the mindset. That little uncertain emoji face is we kind of got it right. Like it happened somewhat, it's on people's minds, but it's really not mass. It's not representing everyone. And then a thumbs down would be wrong. And don't worry if you weren't here last year, I'm gonna explain what each mindset is. So the first one was called dissociation, and that is disconnecting completely from your sense of self or being as a way to cope with the stress, the anxiety, everything that's going on. This one we nailed. Americans relied, many of you might be able to relate to this. I definitely think I can. But Americans relied on checking out to cope with the stress, the anxiety. We had a crazy election year. We had a lot going on. This could be even little moments like driving into the office and kind of forgetting that you were driving and not knowing how you got here, or bigger moments of like completely getting so immersed in a game or something like that that you disconnect from your sense of self. And 1/3 of people, according to Mental Health America, admitted that in this last year, in 2024, they occasionally felt like as they went about their day, it was almost like they were watching themselves in a movie. So they checked out so much that they felt like they were on the other side of things. 2/3 of US adults felt the need to limit their intake of news and check out from that just because it was all too overwhelming. And in 2024, US adults spent 58 minutes scrolling on TikTok per day on average. So that compares to 52 minutes from the year before. So I don't know if any of you were doing that to dissociate, but you really got the numbers up. Idleness. So this is that somewhat right, like starting to happen. We started to see this, but it didn't really become mass. Idleness is, you're probably all familiar, it's just laziness, like inactivity. But what we talked about last year was it's not necessarily a bad thing. Like pausing and being like quote unquote lazy and taking that time to kind of do nothing can also lead to creativity. So we did see some of that. And I think just looking at that, I looked at, okay, there's been this movement and this ask from consumers for this 4-day work week. I'm looking at our HR team, you know, Alan. And so consumers continued to ask for that and spent more time on leisure, but that didn't really materialize. But to give you a little bit of context, I looked at from the 1960s to 2024, what was the time spent on leisure versus the time spent on work. And the time spent on work has actually decreased by 8 hours a week, and the time spent on leisure has actually increased by 7 hours a week. I don't know what happened to that extra hour. It's just evaporated. But to just give you the difference in that, that's really interesting. Like there is more time for that idleness. So that was idleness. And then next is radical acceptance. So I think a lot of you are familiar with this. And I was sharing with some of my friends these mindsets from last year. And one of them said, Mallory, I feel like you were in my therapy sessions last year. That radical acceptance term came up a lot. So again, that one is really being content with the way that things are, especially when things, you don't necessarily agree with them. They're things that go against your values or your morals, but you say, I'm just going to leave it be. I'm not going to stress and worry about it, and I'm going to move on with contentness. So that one we nailed. And that one I kind of thought about, okay, this last year was really a year of breath work, of slowing down, slow leisurely walks, mental health, taking that time for yourself. And I looked at actually meditation. I don't know how many of you meditate, but I looked at really the year before, in a couple years before, 2002, only 18% of Americans meditated weekly. But can you guess how many percent meditated weekly last year? 50%. So a good amount of people really took that time to radically accept, take breath work, and do a lot of other things as well. And then neo-altruism is the final one. So this is altruism, as you know, is giving back in a selfless manner. So donations or volunteering time, effort, energy. And the neo part of it is the context and the layer of doing that within an incredibly stressful time, especially a financially stressful time. You still give back. and you experience this sense of empathetic joy, and you don't expect something in return. So it's truly selfless within that extra layer of like those hard economic times. This one we got somewhat right. So I'd like to give us a break. This last year for consumers was tough financially, stress, lots of competing priorities and energy. So if you look at like Giving USA's just general, how was overall giving, it was down by about 2%, and that's adjusted for inflation. But if you look at donations to political causes, time spent on that, that was way up, obviously, because of the climate of what we had last year. So while people may not have given traditionally quite as much, they definitely spent their time on causes last year. So I think we did pretty well. So going into what you came here for, the 2025 consumer mindset, we're going to really jump into exploring key influences and then what those mindset states are. So as we go into this section, I want you to humor me just a little bit. I really like yoga. I go many times a week, and in yoga class, they often give you a mantra. And I know exactly what the mantra would be for today. It would be, I am not the consumer. This reminder, let's go back to, we have our own feelings as marketers. I think sometimes we like to say, well, consumers must feel this way because I feel this way, but let's try to resist that temptation and try to not make our own feelings and influence them on the consumer. So if you will, humor me, take a moment, repeat after me. I am not the consumer. There you go. Very fun. And then what key factors or influences shape the perspective of Americans? So I'm going to call these key influences. So before we get into the mindsets, we have to understand what's swirling around. What are those factors that people may or may not be aware of are absolutely impacting the way that consumers make decisions, the way that they experience life, their feelings and their emotions. So I focused again on just the US for this one, and these aren't meant to capture everything, but they're capturing kind of the most important themes. So the idea here is that this year and the feeling of this year is really the sense of a paradox, kind of like a contradiction, just like we talked about. So challenges ahead met with hope for a better future. I think a layer on top of all of this that we have to address, we have to talk about is kind of a crazy last year with the election, the political climate, lots of polarization. And no matter what side of the fence you sit on, or if you haven't chosen a side, there was a lot of chaos and a lot of kind of crazy shenanigans going on. So kind of some confusion around this year and mixed feelings about how it's going to net out. So the first one is this idea of financial strain, yet economic growth. So Americans, when polled, still their number one resolution for 2025 is saving money. So that says that this is still really top of mind. Inflation is still above the Fed target at 2.6%, target being 2%. And really kind of that like dichotomy is coming from too with Trump coming in, there's that hope of, okay, things did potentially get a little bit better last time he was in office, but he's placing tariffs. And so that could increase the cost of prices. So there's again, that like duality happening. And really, again, no matter what, and like really where you land, Americans and on average are 72% of them are saving and continually trying to save and cut down their household costs on a weekly basis. So that just says, again, there's this idea of strain, but there's also this hope that things could get better, our economy could improve, and potentially inflation could come down. And then second, this idea of tepid trust in the government. Gallup did this survey at the very end of last year. It was right before Christmas. So this was the time where Biden's kind of still on the track out of office. Trump is the incumbent coming in. And Americans were asked, what is the most critical issue that America is facing right now? And the most responded or shared answer was government. That was at 20%, which just says that, again, no matter what side you're on, there is this lack of trust and this deterioration of trust in the decisions of the government. And then third, this idea of acceleration of technology. So I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't bring this up, knowing where we're headed with AI, technological change, all of that great development. There's really a lot of division on this set of an issue. And according to Pew Research, Americans are increasingly cautious about the growing role of AI in their lives generally. And 52% feel like AI is more scary than it is exciting. So we might again have that lens of AI is super exciting, let's innovate with it, but let's keep in mind that consumers might not have that same feeling as us. And so that great tech divide will continue to really shape our world. And one kind of fun thing to think about here is that TikTok, when TikTok was banned for a hot second, everyone knows that that's China run, that the data goes to China. People jumped ship and went to other China-based platforms to get that fix that they have of watching videos on TikTok. And another one is DeepSeek, which came out. People didn't have a problem going over to DeepSeek and knowing that that data went to China. Yet on the other side of the token, when polled or asked, Americans say by and large, I'm really worried about my privacy. I'm really worried about my data. So again, like two things can be true at the same time. It doesn't always make sense. So given these key influences, I wanted to warm you up. This is an easy round. How do you think these influences might make people feel? Before we go into these mindsets, what are some emotions that are swirling around in your mind? If you're in the room, you can shout it out. I can repeat it. And if you're online, post it to the chat. And my friend Tyler, he will be sure to surface it here. So what emotions start to come up? Fear, timid, anxious, uncertain, impatient.
That emoji that you shared.
The confused emoji. Anything else? Overwhelm. Great. Yeah, I think you nailed it. These are all good things leading into our mindsets. So 2025, the year of redirection. I didn't come up with the year of redirection, so I have to give this one credit. So at Red Door, we subscribe to some research tools to supplement our own knowledge, our own thinking, and give us another perspective. One of those is called World Global Style Network, and it's a leader in trends forecasting. They came up with that concept of the year of redirection, and I thought it did a really good job of encapsulating where we're headed with these mindsets. And what redirection means is that old ideas will be challenged, polarization and divide will continue, but what will emerge is this agreement on an urgent need for change and starting to move towards this rebuild and working towards collective solutions. So often we'll see that in small communities of people banding together, working to problem solve and trying to make that change. So again, this idea of like uncertainty but hope of how do we really redirect? Consumers are going to try to redirect and move forward in a positive way. And wanted to bring back our old poet friend, Robert Frost, because I thought this was perfect for the year of redirection. And this idea of the only way out is through, right? We have a lot of stuff going on in consumers' minds and in the world. And really this idea of like coming to terms with, whereas last year it was just kind of starting to check out, take a back seat, prioritize self. This is, let's get through it. Let's tackle these challenges head on and let's make real change. So let's look at those mindsets. I'm going to unpack each of them further, so I'll go through these quickly on this slide. They're veracity, little victories, yearning, and kinship. So veracity, this first one. What do Ghostbusters, Scooby-Doo, and today's consumers have in common? This really intense seek for truth. And where does this come from? Well, it comes from this idea of consumers waking up to the misinformation around them. In times of stress and anxiety, research suggests, I don't think we need research for this one, I think it makes sense, but that misinformation can spread. And the reason is that our brains are wired to figure something out. So when stuff is chaotic, we try to find those solutions and those answers. And sometimes we get true answers and sometimes we get false answers. So with Veracity, think about this era of AI generated content, swarm intelligence, which is like swarm intelligence is this like concept of like, think of like a bee colony of like people going around and getting intelligence, getting ideas kind of from each other, building off each other. That can lead to swarm disinformation. And I think we've seen that. And an example was in the summertime that fake AI generated image of the Pentagon explosion, which caused a lot of chaos. It caused the stock market also to dip for a temporary amount of time. And so people are waking up to things like that, and consumers are really wanting and demanding truth. So Veracity is, again, that relentless search for truth, really needing to know those answers and needing that sense of honesty. So what to watch for? See those consumers be this beacon of level-headedness, see them demand truth about the products and the services that you offer. Think about companies, some have started using these icons of transparency on AI-related content and images. That will likely continue in response to consumers demanding this. More authentication for online purchases through biometrics. So that could be like fingerprint, face print, making sure that things are private, that things are safe. And rises against counterfeit. That's actually been also a huge problem with online purchases. And just generally more product or service clarity. So no matter what you offer, you ought to be more transparent with exactly what it is, why you do it, and your processes to get there. So that's Veracity. Second one is little victories. So between that chronic, the doom scrolling, the negative news that came out, it can be easy for consumers to see the glass half empty, but that's become so tiresome. It's like we've had a year of doing that, and really it's time for consumers, and they want to see that positive sense. And when polled, consumers by and large said 58% of Americans said that they think that life is worse today than it was 50 years ago. So those negative sentiments can be, again, overwhelming, but as a coping mechanism and a way to move forward, we'll see the emergence of those little victories. And it's authentic because we do see, again, when we saw those key influences, positive change is happening, right? There's those mix of things, there's those hard things that have happened, but turning a corner and making positive change. And little victories can be those micro moments of joy, like today driving in, I saw in a little Mini Cooper a Yorkie dog sitting on someone's lap, and it made me laugh. That's a little victory. Or listening to a song that you really like, your favorite song, and it pumps you up and it makes you have a good day. That could be a little victory. So again, these are small, they're personal, they're different for each person. What I call little victories are probably different than what you believe, but there's some commonality between them. It's that serendipity that comes from those little victories are things that help cope with kind of the trauma that's been going on in the past year, couple years, and also help us move forward and consumers move forward and enact positive change and focus on, realistic optimism. And little victories boost dopamine too. And surges of dopamine, as we're going to talk about a little bit further, are really addictive, right? We want to feel good. Feeling good are like those little Pavlov rewards for people. And so most people know, for example, that part of their social media addiction, like why they get so caught up scrolling through those funny videos on TikTok, is because it gives them a little bit of that dopamine surge, that dopamine rush. It makes them laugh, makes them excited, it gives them something to share with their friends. So we'll see that continue. And it's even funny to think that little victory on social media, it used to be those likes, getting the likes, getting the hearts, but now it could just be watching those videos. So even what gives dopamine is changing. So what to watch for here with little victories? Think about fulfillment, consumers prioritizing fulfillment over happiness or success. So when we're thinking about marketing messages, that's really important. It might be more important for someone to just feel fulfilled. And how do you do that? Through your creative, through the way that you offer your services and product. I think you can really employ those little victories. And then also think of this idea of what's called scene spaces, which can be online or in person, but let's say online. So little small groups, online forums where people have something shared, something in common, like an alumni group or a common, gaming interest, and they work together and find joy because they have that sort of commonality. So our third mindset is yearning. And this is this deep, intense longing or desire for something. I think this is one you can feel just from seeing that word. I think we all have these experiences of yearning. So it's easy to kind of relate to the consumer in this sense. So yearning is the most common response to loss. And in the past couple years, there have been losses of life, losses of jobs, losses of deferred dreams and hopes of having to put things on hold because of mainly the economic state of things, but also other delays in life stages. And so yearning, what it's doing is really leading people to retreat into the comfort and delay some of these mile markers, traditional mile markers in society and in adulthood, because they're feared or they're deemed unattainable. So there's a concept of chrononormativity, and what that means is that by a certain age, you need to get married. By a certain age, you need to buy a home. By a certain age, you need to have kids. And people are challenging that and saying, it's not attainable. We don't want to really hear about that. And let's, in fact, highlight and talk about those alternative routes and talk about what's really realistic and what's really happening in the world. And as a part of that, we're going to talk about in a little bit nostalgia. And nostalgia is one of those really coping mechanisms for yearning. It's that return to the comfort of the past. And over half of consumers say that they're extremely likely, if not somewhat likely, to buy a product that triggers nostalgia for them because it really feeds into and validates that feeling of yearning. And we've even seen on TikTok posts of yearn posting where people talk about lost loves, different stories. And it's, again, that forum to really share that longing for that past and kind of what could have been and those different mile markers in life that are happening now. So what to watch for? Watch out for consumers in this year pushing back a little more than they have on consumerism and saying, I'm going to slow down a little bit. I want to buy things that make me feel good, that feel slower, that feel better, that feel a little bit more authentic. But brands will still have to help them really regulate those emotions. So that's the concept of yearning. And then finally, kinship. So this is a close connection that's formed through relationships, not necessarily the familial bond. I'm going to talk about kinship in the sense of these small communities that are being created to drive that connection and really increase that dopamine. So people are going to opt out of this corporate optimization, this do more, do more, do more, get more done. And instead, they're going to really look into creating these chosen families. So what this could look like is these small senses of community where we've even seen people sharing cars, finances, things like that. So really within this close-knit community, there's shared values and there's trust. So again, that response to distrust happening externally, creating these small communities where there is that trust and there is that community. So again, community is a way to build up that dopamine to get that happiness through connection to others. But what's changing in 2025 is that community size is going to get smaller, not bigger. So we'll see a lot of impacts on that for the online channels that we have and those in-person channels that we have. Think smaller, not bigger when it comes to community. So a couple of interesting things to watch for besides smaller communities is just this idea of hyper local. So are you understanding the cultural nuances and the nuances and values of your consumers? You ought to segment them into different personas to be able to reach and empathize with these smaller communities. There's also that idea of rural retail, which is hyper local, even in-person experiences, which will help in the long term really build up that brand affinity and connection. And also think about this idea that's coming up of third places, which are physical places outside of the home, school, and work. And these are places where people can have come together with shared values. Again, think kinship, not in the familial sense, but in the really created family sense. So examples of this could be co-working nursery spaces where people come together, mothers with their children, kind of trade off, work together. There's actually, this exists, psychedelics libraries in New York. So just different hobbies, different ways for people to come together. And then also just these idea of, I've seen immersive daycare centers that are multi-generational. This is really cool, where kids actually go in and perform some tasks. So again, like that kinship of creating those shared values across even different generations. So that's the idea of kinship. So after seeing those mindsets, any initial questions before we head into how this comes together in predictions? Making sense so far? Okay, great. So this idea of, again, why do we look at consumer mindsets? So environment and values. So those were the key influences, right? Those are economic state, political climate, and also technological advances, great divide in tech. Those create the mindset and behaviors. So those are what we just went through, those consumer mindsets. So yearning, little victories, kinship, veracity. And ultimately that influences purchase decisions, which is probably where your ears perk up. So that's really where, as a marketer, you're tasked with growing revenue, growing loyalty, building those brands, and that's really where you come into effect. So considering this consumer mindset, okay, so we know that there's these influences. We know that now, if you believe me, these are going to be the mindsets for the rest of 2025. How will marketing change? Like, what is that? How does that impact your day-to-day jobs? What should you be thinking about here, besides really trying to put on that cap of the consumer mindset? And again, remember my disclaimer, predictions are dangerous. We'll see how I did when we come back next year. But I'm going to argue that given all of this, what is buying going to look like? It's going to shift to this idea of hyper-intentional consumerism. This idea that consumers are going to be incredibly selective and curious and really picky about what they buy, where they spend their time, and even who they spend their time with, and who could be brand. And this idea, this old German saying was trust but verify, that's gone. It's now don't trust and verify. So like this idea of like needing to know the facts, needing to feel connected and have that information before considering that product. So if that's that overarching kind of consumer mindset, then what does that mean for marketing? I'm going to argue that the scales will tip. So whereas we've been in this era of marketing to people, like selling to people, hey, here's this thing, buy it for these reasons. These are my reasons to believe. These are my proof points. The power shift is gonna resurge back to the consumer. They're gonna be the ones that are gonna be in charge or wanna be in charge. So think about that for a minute. How do we do that? How do we accommodate that? It's really this idea of co-creation with your buyers and your target audience, making them part of the marketing, part of the story. So how do you create content with them, not just for them? How do you help them participate in the experience? So you're launching a new product. Why not get feedback? Why not crowdsource that? Why not ask what people want and really work together with consumers to help them participate? So here's where I promised you all are going to have a part in this. You have your handy dandy handouts. I see a lot of you have them. Jot down some thoughts as I go through each prediction about what does it mean for marketing? So given each prediction, what do I need to do as a marketer? What do I need to think about as a marketer? And I'd love to hear all of your great ideas. I'll pause after each prediction and we'll kind of play around with those so that you can walk away with something tangible to bring back to your day-to-day job. All right, so prediction 1, this is community size shrinks. And I think I set this up pretty well earlier of just this idea of community is going to get smaller. Again, think veracity and think kinship. So how do those come together? Really people wanting these close-knit, tight-knit groups of people that they can trust. So we saw, for example, that remote work migration, so this ability to work remotely, has shifted a lot of especially young professionals into this whole new level of small community. So as an example, many Americans, again, especially those younger ones, left some expensive urban areas to seek smaller town living in smaller locations. And in the digital space, like that's the physical space, but the digital space, that same thing is happening. So what's happening there is that, like, take Meta or Facebook, there once was like newsfeed and a lot of that group sharing, public sharing. Users are leaving that for private Discord pages, which are private groups really centered around gaming interests, or even just private messaging. So again, veracity, kinship, wanting to move to smaller communities, that has a lot of implications on what we do as marketers. And we, again, need to think a lot smaller than we do bigger. Another one that I love is Instagram to Be Real. So Instagram, again, it's, has ads, it's more public, that sort of posting, and Be Real is this more like authentic, quick way of spontaneously sharing videos. So given that prediction, if community size shrinks, what does this mean for marketing? So practically, again, embrace those online small groups. So when you're thinking about your media plan, when you're thinking about your social media plan, reconsider those mass platforms and pepper in, test, try some of those smaller, more private spaces. Support social vetting. So this is an interesting one too that comes from that veracity, that pursuit of the relentless truth, is consumers are going to want to know more about products pre-purchase, and they're going to ask that close-knit group around them. So maybe those private groups online, or maybe they're going to come and ask their friend. So support that, give them the facts, and also empower a community of advocates for your brand. Localize efforts. So do your homework and understand, again, what are those personas? What are those localized cultural value nuances? That's what's going to make really your work, your creative, your marketing really resonate. Global messaging does have a purpose, but we also need to think in terms of small communities and how that trickles down, and it might not be a one size fits all. And then co-create, I love this one. This comes from that idea of consumers also wanting to participate and being part of brand. Expect community-run pop-ups, collective decision-making, even like crowd-voted product changes. So how can you incorporate small community? And then lean into co-op commerce. This is a really fascinating one to pay attention to. I don't know if some of you have seen it in your jobs, but collective investments. So a group of people, and not necessarily like a familial group, remember, like kinship, those untraditional groups coming together and making community-based decisions and buying in community. So like co-ops, like for example, a set of people going in on purchasing like part of a cow or part of a dairy farm so that they can have those products. So really just interesting ways to think about community. So I'll pause there, and I'd love to hear your ideas. What else will happen with community size shrinking? What other ideas or thoughts do you have, or questions? Kate, yeah, Tyler will pass you the mic.
I guess this is more of a question. I'm curious what your thoughts are on, if you can remember maybe 5 years ago when, for example, Soul Cycle was like the community to be a part of, but it was on this like mass scale, and it was, oh, someone's in it, I want to be in it. Do you feel like now if these small online groups get too big, we're back to that point, or is it, how do you think it'll manage between those two feelings?
Yeah, great question. I think definitely we don't want those things to go to mass. I think when they get bigger, like those groups, and it has since disbanded, to your point, because it got too big, it got too general. So don't lose the localized components, break out those large group into smaller groups and tie people together with shared values and let them have conversations around that. So maybe you can break out those groups into different geos or different types of cycling that people like or enjoy. And what's interesting too, you brought up a great point that we'll talk about in a minute, is like that dopamine surge that you get from the rewards that a program like that has, that was another reason why there's that loyalty. It's like gamified. Like I'm achieving certain milestones, and so I'm therefore getting this like dopamine of like, I got a badge, I did this many cycles, I did this many workouts. And it's that social platform of like feeling like a small community where I can like on Peloton, you can high five somebody or something like that. Sometimes it's a little bizarre. So like, who gave me a high five? But still there is that feeling of like, it feels like a small community. So question. Any other questions or ideas?
This is great, Mal. One thing that came to mind when you were talking about the localized efforts is a lot of times when you're doing a larger campaign or creating content, it is more efficient from a budget perspective to go more broad stroke, right? Mm-hmm. So whether that's in the content themes you're developing, or you mentioned channels and things mm-hmm. like that. So immediately I'm thinking like, if we really need to lean into these niche groups that respond more, if we're being more specific to them, should we also consider a balance in our budget efficiency? Because we might be nailing our target audience more, but it's in a little bit more hyper-focused way, mm-hmm. and evaluating kind of the overarching success of the program versus one specific campaign.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great question. I would say absolutely. The first thing I would say too is if there is limited budget, test smaller communities against your mass, your corporate campaigns, and then set different metrics. I think, again, check out that brand building playbook. It has a lot of good thoughts there, but you should be measuring that community engagement, community building differently than you would performance marketing or ROI. And that's really for that long-term gain. So I would say test if there's limited budget, then scale, and then also think about that balance of brand and performance KPIs.
Just another channel thought is, and marketers have to tread very lightly, but Reddit. Mm-hmm. Subreddits are an example of those smaller communities, right? And it has the added benefit of showing up in search a lot. Kind of recent algorithm updates the last year or so, Reddit is, and you might have noticed in your personal life, Reddit showing up a lot in Google, and they also did a deal with OpenAI, so it's part of ChatGPT's training set. So a lot of like knock-on effects from that potentially. And outside of like, again, you need to tread lightly as a brand, but there's also advertising options there. So mm-hmm. That are probably underutilized, I think, in my opinion. Mm-hmm.
Reddit is a great one with specific topics with passionate communities I've seen. Very passionate people. Did Alan, you have one?
Yeah, this was something I'd be curious on your leaning into co-op commerce and touching on the fact that there are a lot of communities that are trying to stay under the radar. If that's anything you noticed, I think of a co-op commerce, a sort of informal economy, is a common thing among folks who live in immigrant communities, for example. I was wondering if that was anything you noticed in the research and how marketers could approach that tricky thing.
Absolutely. And I think that goes back, it's a great point, Alan, of like protecting and being respectful and maintaining the desires of those audiences and like caring enough to do that research and homework to understand those values, right? Of this idea of like being more narrow, not going so broad, having that sensitivity. So if those are communities, leaving them as they are and not spending your time, energy really surfacing those, being respectful. So at the end of the day, again, like consumers want to co-create with brands and want to be respected and seen. And if that means not blowing something up, then that's the right thing to do.
Hello. This is probably a loaded question, but my mind goes to the Radius and Chalk merge. And with this growing hospital system, I'm curious if you have any initial thoughts of like, how do we appear as a small, tight niche, small community while trying to like maintain and gain the trust of like our patients in the community? As we're growing, but wanting to appear small. If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I would say like for that, it's going back to the way that you build small community is like, what are the need states? What are those different shared values of like, that is a very sensitive subject. So probably parents, going through similar experiences. And I think it's building those support communities, and not necessarily going that like mass route, but making sure that you understand, respect, pay attention to, and really fuel those individual communities of support. So there's probably just a lot of different sectors of like types of care. So focusing on that. And then I think just as you scale and as you bring audiences together, not losing that authenticity of like sharing the purpose of what that brand stands for. And I just think a big part of the way that you do that is just talking to the real customers, talking to them about like, what do you love about Chalk that we want to maintain in this, and giving them that part in that, and making sure that, again, they have that shared participation in the brand. So doing your homework, understanding what those values and those must keeps are, and holding true to that. And then also just highlighting those smaller communities, I think centered around probably types of care. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, quickly. Because my countdown is counting down really fast.
I was just going to say, one of the values of scale is actually you can create smaller communities because you have a bigger base of people to work from. If you're a smaller entity, you only have 2 people. That's not really much of a community with a cross section of those values.
Right.
Whereas if you have a large Peloton community or something like that, you can get on micro details and still have volume to create a community.
Absolutely. And you can look at the data across that when you have a big community and you have that information and data to be able to segment. All right. Love it. Second prediction, journalists go direct to consumer. This one actually started as podcasts outpace, take over traditional news, but I think it's more than that. There's this really inherent and like big sense of trust with podcasters. Why is that? Like, you're hearing direct from the source, whether or not you are, it feels that way. It feels like there's transparency, and you can dive in and get more in depth on different topics. And as of 2024, about 42% of Americans listen to podcasts monthly, which is up from 12% in 2013. And we can see within the traditional news cycle, news viewership, that's down. So already more people are turning to podcasts. Like, there's one called Breaking Points, which is a news outlet. And we'll see that more and more. We'll see those journalists go direct. There's plus sides to that. And then there's also like this idea of like, where's your boss? Is anyone kind of verifying this? But to consumers, they feel like, again, it's that like, it's more authentic. They're looking for truth, out with that trust but verify, and in with don't trust and verify. So what does this mean for marketing? So own up. Like, again, this is about veracity. This is about truth. That is the prediction, but I'm trying to apply this to your day-to-day. So when mistakes happen, don't just own up to them, but also share those steps for improvement and share the follow-through. Micro over mass influencers. Avoid those scripted influencers. Consumers are getting tired of that. Look for, again, those smaller communities you can tap into. Be real. So present the objective facts, but also present the messy side of the story. Consumers want to hear that unfiltered, imperfect side. We can, of course, jazz it up a little bit. It doesn't have to be everything doom and gloom, but share some of the unfiltered content, share some of those cuts. And then imperfect storytelling wins. So shift away from brand-led towards consumer-led content. Let the consumer tell your story. I'm not going to open that one up or the next one up for discussion given time, but I'll open it up in just a minute. Dopamine creates brand addicts. So dopamine is that neurotransmitter in our brains that plays a role in motivation. It also plays a role in like happiness and these moments of joy. And it's highly addictive, getting these surges of dopamine. So it could be like the thrill, for example, of Amazon. You can literally just click once and you have this like pretty little package at your door tomorrow. Like that's a thrill. That's a surge of dopamine. Or it could be something like YouTube where it's on autoplay. So there's this joy of like, I can keep watching the tube. It never has to end. The glory days never have to be over. Or engagement programs. I love that you mentioned this, Kate, but like Peloton or Garmin, where I love the badges. I love getting the badges. It keeps you motivated. It keeps you engaged. And it makes you feel a little special and joyous. So what this means for marketing, go for those small wins. So instead of focusing on some of those like product service outcomes that are so big, like make your life better, like break it down into something really small. And consumers are focused on little successes, as little as drinking more water, which that's a great thing. I'm not saying it's, but that's just how little we're talking here. Remove fear. So shift away from that fear-based marketing, like take any of that out, given the consumer mindset, and focus on progress based. And then affirm. So validate those non-traditional choices. Remember those delays and those markers of adulthood, and shift from aspiration to affirmation. So affirm and show that you see people as they are, even if they don't achieve that certain milestone. And in fact, highlight when they don't achieve it or achieve it in a different way than it traditionally looks. And then nostalgia is a rocket launch. So to my father, who is actually an aerospace engineer, this is not real. This is just, I was having fun. This is a metaphor. But what will happen here is, again, that nostalgia. So nostalgia is this warm hug of comfort. But in 2025, and this is where I want you to listen up, nostalgia isn't going to be like Clark Griswold in Christmas Vacation, where he's like, sobbing over his old family photos. Like nostalgia is going to be a way to progress in the future. So consumers are going to want to hear that song that they listened to in high school, or they're going to want to reconnect with alumni or old people that they went to school with. And they're going to want to talk about shared values to create common solutions. Again, remember that sense of redirection. So think about that. Of like, how do you really produce that nostalgia in marketing? So market with the way we used to do it, bring back some of those vintage aesthetics. People love vinyl, people love Y2K clothes, like all of those things right now. Experience the past, use some multi-sensory campaigns. You can do that in product packaging, like scents, to really bring back those feelings or senses of the past. Create reunions of people coming together that had a shared experience, and channel selective nostalgia. So again, don't just be sentimental, but inspire simpler, more fulfilling behaviors. It's that sense of progress. And then my final prediction, and don't freak out. I know we like AI here, we're marketers, but again, I am not the consumer. Artificial intelligence is a silent intruder. So again, as I went back to those stats, like 52% of Americans are more nervous than they are about AI, and only 10% are more excited than they are nervous. So concerns about privacy, concerns about it taking over their jobs and things like that. But the idea is that AI is already infiltrating systems of healthcare, systems of work. And so this idea of it's not going to be this like hand raise, I accept AI, I'm going for it. By and large, consumers, it's going to be part of their daily lives. That's going to be undeniable, but it's not going to be an active adoption. And there were a couple of personas that I thought were interesting just to show you the divide of AI. And John shared this with me. So there's doomers, people that think that AI will just cause total catastrophe and doom. There's gloomers, they're skeptical about AI, but they're like kind of trying it out. There's Zoomers, they're enthusiastic adopters of AI, people that are using it in their daily lives for work. And then there's Bloomers, so these are the innovators of AI. So think about just how much divide there is in that fact. So what does this mean for marketing? More than not, consumers might not notice AI usage, marketers do, but consider you can use content, photos, things like that that are AI. Just be sure to kind of disclaim and verify that. Build mental availability with AI, just like you build brand preference with consumers, you have to build that with AI so that you're showing up in those searches. And then pay attention to digital privacy. Again, this is kind of a contradiction, but consumers are saying that they want that privacy. So they're going to look for brands that at least on the surface have that, even if they don't choose that. So to wrap it up, and we can open it for Q&A in a minute, how to win in 2025. So if leaving you with just like a couple quick things of like, okay, what do I do as a marketer? Number one, prioritize authenticity overall. 2, focus on personal progress, highlighting those personal stories over mass aspiration, small communities. 3, community first marketing. Again, community size shrinks. Think about how you can stand those up with shared values. And then nostalgia, past plus future is the new present. So incorporate those feelings of nostalgia for forward progress. So before I open it up for questions, just to wrap, thank you so much. This was really fun for spending time with me. don't worry too much about that crazy analogy that I had in the beginning about bartership and Valentine's Day. I really hope you do enjoy love and truffles and chocolates and hugs that day. And I'll be around if you have questions. Thank you so much. Right. I know we've reached our time, Tyler. So if there are questions, I'm happy to stay. If you have to roll out, no problem. You can roll out.
Any immediate questions from the audience here?
This was a bit more of an observation that is followed with a question, but I think we're already seeing the rollout of that small community effect, especially across social media. Like he called out with Reddit being a big area where consumers tend to seek out their peers over the expertise of like a customer support person or even, yeah, I guess just buyer insights from their peers over just like information online of like reviewers. How do brands lean into peer-to-peer, I guess, advocacy versus trying to kind of force it on their own through like general marketing?
And peer-to-peer advocacy, you mean developing these people who are advocates for your brand on that smaller local level?
Exactly.
Yeah, I think it goes back to that like understanding of like what are those people's values, what are their motivations, and talking to them about like what do they love about your brand, like getting personal with that. It obviously scales of like based on the size of brand that you are, your ability to do that. If you're really large, you might not be able to do that on like as personal of a level. You could send emails, you could send surveys, but if it is a smaller community, you might be able to have some like interaction and more direct insights. So I think it is going back again to that idea of like, I love how you captured that. It's like that co-creation with people and like this idea of like marketing is shifting in that sense and consumers want to be a part of the brand. And so lean into that and they're raising their hand and willing to do it. So again, just like get the insights about what they value and love about your brand, play into those, and people will want to participate in that.
Awesome. Thanks.
Oh, on the remote, they can't hear you. You'll have to have the mic.
This is more of a comment, and I don't remember all of the mindsets from last year, but when you pulled them back, my immediate thought was like, wow, there's a lot of duality and polarity in that. And the mindsets for this year seem to be much more cohesive. So I was just curious, like, how do you think that will play out? I mean, in my mind, it's more like maybe like the brand platform or the creative platform is easier to come up with, but now the tactics are probably a little bit different. So just curious to get your opinion.
Yeah. And you're right. Like last year, there was just so much uncertainty. I think a lot of that too is like political climate, election, like so much was just like up in the air. It was a big year. And so the mindsets were so like, they were kind of on both sides. This year, there's more of that like redirection towards change. And I think you're right. I will say these mindsets are like broad stroke, right? So take them, then filter them down for your brand. And I think there will be more of that agreement on the direction, the overall direction. But then to your point, especially with the rise of the small communities, those tactics need to be more pointed and more customized and a little bit more like value oriented than they did before. Last year, it was like dissociation, all of that. It was like, how do I even get like attention? Like, how do I even get noticed? And this year, it's like, okay, consumers are paying attention. They want to know the facts. They want to be a part of it. So I think just leaning into that, and you're right, like it will be easier to come up with that overarching message, but then the harder work will be engaging in those small communities and getting that piece right. You're welcome. Any other final questions?
We got time for one more, and then we can segue to networking and more questions then. Or we can segue right now. Awesome. Fantastic job, Mal.
Thank you.